expanse of the North Pacific, where the ocean floor plunged into abyssal depths and currents carried the whispers of ancient migrations, a blue whale named Nerida faced the greatest challenge of her 90-year life. At nearly 100 feet in length and weighing close to 200 tons, she was among the largest creatures ever to grace the planet. Yet in this moment, she had never felt more vulnerable. The crisis began 3 days earlier when a massive underwater earthquake, registering 8.2 on the Richter scale, had torn through the Mendocino fracture zone. The seismic event triggered a series of underwater landslides that fundamentally altered the ocean's topography in ways that would take marine scientists months to fully understand. For Nerida, the immediate consequence was catastrophic. The earthquake had severed her connection to the magnetic navigation system that had guided her species for millions of years. Blue whales possessed an extraordinary ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field, using it like an internal compass during their epic migrations between feeding and breeding grounds. This biological GPS, more sophisticated than any human technology, allowed them to navigate across thousands of miles of seemingly featureless ocean with pinpoint accuracy. But the earthquake had created magnetic anomalies that scrambled these natural signals, leaving Nerida disoriented in waters that should have been as familiar as her own heartbeat. The disorientation struck her like a physical blow. One moment she had been following the ancient pathways carved by countless generations of her ancestors, and the next she found herself swimming in circles, her internal compass spinning wildly. The magnetic chaos created a sensation akin to vertigo, making her massive body feel unsteady in the water that had always been her sanctuary. Worse still, the earthquake had disrupted the delicate ecosystem she depended upon for survival. The landslides had buried vast krill beds under tons of sediment, while the seismic activity had scattered the remaining swarms across an area too large for efficient feeding. Krill, the tiny shrimp-like creatures that formed the foundation of her diet, required specific water temperatures and current patterns to concentrate in the dense clouds that made feeding worthwhile for a creature of Nerida's size. A blue whale needed to consume up to 4 tons of krill daily during feeding season to build the blubber reserves that would sustain them through their long migrations and breeding periods. With the krill population scattered and the magnetic navigation system compromised, Nerida faced the terrifying prospect of starvation in an ocean that had always provided abundance. The first day after the earthquake, she attempted to follow her usual feeding patterns, diving to depths of 300 feet where krill typically concentrated during daylight hours. Her massive throat pleats expanded like an accordion as she engulfed enormous volumes of water. But when she expelled the seawater through her baleen plates, the catch was disappointingly sparse, barely enough to sustain her massive metabolism, let alone build the energy reserve she needed. By the second day, hunger began to gnaw at her with increasing intensity. The metabolic demands of her enormous body were relentless, burning through her existing blubber reserves at an alarming rate. She could feel her strength beginning to ebb, a subtle but unmistakable weakening that threatened to cascade into a death spiral if she couldn't locate substantial food sources soon. It was during this period of growing desperation that Nerida made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She would have to abandon the traditional feeding grounds that her species had used for millennia and venture into uncharted waters in search of krill populations that might have escaped the earthquake's disruption. The journey into unknown territory began at dawn on the third day. Without her magnetic compass to guide her, Nerida had to rely on more primitive navigation methods that her species had largely forgotten. She began to pay attention to subtle changes in water temperature and salinity, the angle of sunlight filtering down from the surface, and the complex patterns of ocean currents that carried chemical signatures from distant regions. The sun became her primary reference point, its position helping her maintain a general sense of direction even as she ventured far from familiar waters. She learned to read the subtle variations in water density that indicated different current systems, following thermal layers that might lead to upwelling zones where nutrients could concentrate marine life. Her first breakthrough came when she detected a faint chemical signature in the water, the distinctive scent trail left by a massive krill swarm that had passed through the area hours earlier. The trail was old and diffuse, but it represented the first concrete evidence she had found of substantial prey since the earthquake. Following the scent trail required skills that Narita had never fully developed. Unlike the straightforward navigation of traditional migration routes, tracking scattered prey demanded constant attention to minute changes in water chemistry. She had to swim slowly, frequently pausing to sample the water and adjust her course based on the strengthening or weakening of the krill's chemical signature. The trail led her through an underwater canyon system that she had never encountered before. The canyon walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating an alien landscape of rocky outcroppings and thermal vents that painted the water in strange colors. Bioluminescent creatures she had never seen before drifted past like living stars, their cold light creating an otherworldly atmosphere in the deep water. As she navigated the canyon, Narita encountered other marine life that had also been displaced by the earthquake. A pod of sperm whales, normally deep diving specialists, had been forced into shallower waters when their usual hunting grounds were buried under landslide debris. They watched her passage with curious eyes, recognizing a fellow giant struggling to adapt to the ocean's sudden transformation. The canyon system proved to be a refuge for various species displaced by the seismic activity. Schools of fish that normally inhabited different depth zones had been mixed together, creating unusual feeding opportunities for some predators while leaving others struggling to find familiar prey. The earthquake had essentially reshuffled the ocean's ecosystem, forcing every creature to adapt or perish. Following the krill trail through this underwater maze tested every aspect of Narita's intelligence and adaptability. The chemical signature grew stronger as she progressed deeper into the canyon system, but the route became increasingly treacherous. Narrow passages barely wide enough for her massive body alternated with sudden drops into abyssal depths that seemed to swallow all light and sound. At one point, she encountered a passage so narrow that she had to exhale completely to compress her body enough to squeeze through. The sensation was claustrophobic and terrifying for a creature accustomed to the infinite freedom of open ocean. Her massive pectoral fins scraped against the rocky walls, leaving behind patches of skin that would take weeks to heal. But the scent trail continued to strengthen, driving her forward despite the physical discomfort and growing exhaustion. Her blubber reserves were now critically low, and she could feel her body beginning to consume muscle tissue to maintain basic metabolic functions. The point of no return was approaching rapidly. Soon she would lack the energy to continue hunting, regardless of what prey she might locate. The breakthrough came as she emerged from the narrowest section of the canyon into a vast underwater valley that opened like a hidden world beneath the waves. The water here was different, richer in nutrients and teeming with microscopic life that created a faint green tinge visible even at depth. And there, suspended in the water like a living cloud, was the largest concentration of krill she had ever encountered. The swarm stretched for miles in every direction, so dense that it created its own ecosystem. Small fish darted through the krill cloud like silver bullets, while larger predators circled the edges, picking off stragglers. The earthquake that had scattered most krill populations had apparently driven this massive swarm into the protected valley, where they had concentrated to an almost unprecedented degree. Narita's approach to the swarm required careful strategy. Her massive size meant that she could easily scatter the krill if she moved too aggressively, potentially losing this precious opportunity. Instead, She positioned herself at the edge of the swarm and began the feeding technique that her species had perfected over millions of years of evolution. Opening her massive jaws to nearly 90 degrees, she accelerated toward the densest part of the krill cloud. Her throat pleats expanded dramatically as she engulfed an enormous volume of water and krill, nearly 16,000 gallons in a single gulp. The sensation of her mouth filling with the tiny protein-rich creatures was like experiencing salvation itself. The feeding process required precise timing and technique. After engulfing the water and krill, Narita had to use her massive tongue, which weighed as much as an elephant, to force the water out through her baleen plates while retaining the krill. The baleen, made of the same material as human fingernails, acted like a giant sieve that trapped prey while allowing water to escape. Each feeding lunge yielded thousands of krill, but Narita needed to repeat the process dozens of times to satisfy her enormous appetite. She worked methodically through the swarm, taking care not to exhaust herself with overly aggressive feeding that might scatter her prey before she had consumed enough to restore her energy reserves.